My name is Derek Lambert, and I used to believe my sacred texts were literal history. I've also taken an interest in studying the sacred text of Muslims, who also believe their stories are literal history, or at least most of them do. But the more I studied the Qur'an with my background knowledge of comparative mythology, the more obvious it became that the so-called unique revelations are just recycled stories dressed in new clothes. These are not divine truths etched in stone. They are the handiwork of human storytellers. This is exactly what we see in the Qur'an. Muslims, especially apologists, will often claim their book contains the corrected versions of earlier biblical stories. But let's be honest. The Qur'an doesn't contain originally correct versions of anything, of the Torah or the Gospel. It derails from them. What's really happening is that Muhammad, or those penning the Qur'an, are hearing different versions of circulating traditions, Christian legends, Jewish folklore, oral campfire stories, hagiography, and they're reworking them into their own narrative. That's not correction. That's adaptation. And it goes straight to the heart of the Islamic dilemma. Let's see if any Muslim apologist can truly explain away the obvious human origins of the Qur'an. Inshallah, we get to hear their defense to this series. And if we don't hear any deep critiques from the popular ones that are out there, ladies and gentlemen, we all know why. The Qur'an gives full authority to the Torah and the Gospel. Yet those very scriptures contradict the Qur'an at key points. How does that add up? Christians actually preserve their scriptures. We can check the Greek Septuagint and even compare it with the Hebrew manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls. That gives us a paper trail. If there were any tweaks, we can see them. But Islam, it claims the Jews and Christians corrupted their texts. Yet, there is no evidence of this supposed pure Torah or pure gospel. No manuscripts, no fragments, nothing earlier than the Qur'an itself in the 7th century. So where is this uncorrupted scripture supposed to be hiding? If the answer is simply, an angel in the cave told me so, then we're no longer talking about history. We're talking about faith and naivety. Even stranger, the Qur'an keeps referencing a single gospel in the singular, something that doesn't even exist in Christian tradition. It sounds far less like divine revelation and far more like Muhammad didn't really understand what the gospel even was. Many critical scholars have highlighted this, and you will see why through this series. What Muslim apologists would like for you to believe is this. The earlier Jewish Torah and Christian Gospels were at one point divine revelation from God, but they corrupted them. Yet somehow this 7th century prophet has the pre-corrupted truth from the Torah and Gospel. If you ask for any evidence of this pre-corrupted Torah or Gospel, they have zilch. In fact, the evidence points to the reality that Muhammad is the one who's likely corrupting these materials from Christians and Jews. You must factor in that I have long been known to argue against Christian and Jewish claims, meaning I have no dog, God, in the fight for defending Christianity or Judaism. It's just common sense to realize that a new religion with a new prophet appearing 600 years after Christianity's origins and around 1,000 years after Judaism's likely origins is the one inventing the new ideas, aka corrupting prior teachings, especially when no Muslim can produce the Gospel or Torah without corruption from much earlier times. Muslims love to claim continuity with these traditions and also want to make a major break from them. The apologists would argue they don't have a new religion, rather they are the uncorrupted, preserved continuity of Christianity and Judaism. Adam was a Muslim, as was all the prophets, and of course Jesus too. However, Jesus wasn't the Son of God, because God can have no sons to them. They want to claim ancient pedigree, yet radically break away from the prior religions they claim to be the most authentic of. When you look at Islam next to Mormonism, the parallels are almost eerie. Muhammad claimed Jews and Christians had corrupted their scriptures, so God gave him the Qur'an, or at least that's what modern apologists argue. The Qur'an is a different question when you dig into the details. Centuries later, though, Joseph Smith said radically similar things about Christianity. It had gone astray. So God sent him the Book of Mormon, written, he claimed, on golden plates delivered by an angel. Both men recycled older stories with their own spin, creating continuity with the past while carving out a bold break from it. But what evidence did either leave? In Islam's case, no trace of an uncorrupted Torah or Gospel has ever surfaced, only the Quran itself, centuries later. In Mormonism's case, Smith produced a circle of witnesses who signed testimonies saying they saw the plates. But here's the catch. Some later admitted they saw them only in visions, not with their physical eyes. No plates survive, no archaeology backs it up, and no external evidence confirms the Book of Mormon's world. Both faiths demand belief, not on facts, but on revelation. And the fingerprints of human invention are obvious. The Book of Mormon borrows whole sections straight from the King James Bible, right down to its 17th century English phrasing. It retools biblical stories into a new tale about Israelites migrating to the Americas, but laces it with 19th century obsessions, Native Americans, revivalist Protestant debates, Freemasonry, and the anti-Catholic rhetoric. That is not timeless revelation, that's local cultural remix. Smith didn't stop there. He produced new scriptures, Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price, layering on innovations. He radically redefined God, moving away from Christian Trinitarianism to a theology where God was an exalted man and humans could become gods themselves. He introduced polygamy and a unique priesthood authority that gave him unchecked power, similar to how Muhammad introduced polygamy. Most dramatically, he relocated salvation history to America, turning the New World into God's final stage. And you kind of wonder if the Quran's changing of the Holy Land is moving toward Mecca in a similar fashion. When you strip away the faith claims, Muhammad and Joseph Smith look like two sides of the same coin. Charismatic leaders who claimed older revelations were corrupted, produced a new book from heaven, borrowed heavily from existing traditions, and reshaped them for their own audiences. That's not divine truth. It's human myth-making, bold and obvious. Muhammad's embrace of polygamy stood out in its 7th century context. By then, it looked archaic to Jews and outright sinful to Christians. But within Islam, it was reframed as legitimate, even holy, because it aligned him with the patriarchs and kings of Israel. The difference is that Jews and Christians had largely moved past polygamy, while Muhammad reintroduced it as divinely sanctioned. The Bible is full of polygamists, and not just obscure figures, the big names. Abraham took Hagar alongside Sarah, then Keturah after Sarah's death. Jacob fathered Israel's tribes through 4 women, Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah. Moses had a Cushite wife besides Zipporah. Gideon had many wives, Judges 8:30. Elkanah had 2, Hannah and Peninnah. David collected multiple wives and concubines, and Solomon outdid them all with 700 wives and 300 concubines. 1 Kings 11:3. Even minor kings like Rehoboam, Abijah, Jehoram, and Joash had harems. These examples became the exact ones both prophets pointed to in order to justify their desire for many wives. Both Muhammad and Joseph Smith carved out unique exemptions that set them above their followers. Ordinary believers had limits. 4 wives in Islam, 1 wife in mainstream Mormon practice, but the prophet himself had unlimited access justified by revelation. From a critical lens, that's not divine law, but classic cult-leading advantage, rewriting the rules to expand their own power. I can picture Muslim apologists pointing at Joseph Smith as a fraud and creating lists of critiques. And I can see Mormon apologists condemning Muhammad as a false prophet. How do we get them to see it? That's why this series is so important. We're going to look at all the obvious stories in the Qur'an, from the sleepers in the cave to Solomon and the Hopi bird, to Gog and Magog, to Jesus speaking from the cradle, plus many, many more, and show how every one of them is traceable to older myths, legends, folklore, and hagiography. And yes, even the foundational story of Gabriel visiting Muhammad in a cave turns out to be just that, very likely a legend, with no historical reliability from the first stone. The castle of historicity collapses. Now, if you want to believe that God works through stories in some mysterious way, that's your liberty. Go ahead. But let's be clear. The claim that these are literal history is unsustainable. The shackles of dogma melt when faced with the cold hard facts of myth, legend, folklore, and hagiography. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The freedom that comes with recognizing the human fingerprints in these stories is far more powerful than clinging to apologetics. Welcome to the human origins of the Qur'an. In this very first episode, we begin with the sleepers in the cave, a story borrowed from Christian hagiography, a story many Christians themselves recognized as edifying stories, yet repackaged in the Qur'an as revelation. If that doesn't make you question the entire foundation of this tradition, nothing will. The story of the 7 sleepers took off in the mid-5th century, just after Theodore of Mopsuestia died. Theodore, around 350 to 428 AD, was famous for calling out miracle tales and saint legends as exaggerations, insisting they weren't scripture and shouldn't be treated as history. His approach makes it clear he would have put this story in the pious fiction category. And he wasn't alone. Eusebius often distanced himself from miracle stories with phrases like, "it is said," showing doubt. Augustine admitted many miracle tales floating around in his day were products of rumor and exaggeration. Even Rufinus repeated miracle stories only with caveats like, "the people say." So while nobody in late antiquity flat out wrote, "the sleeper's story never happened," leading Christian thinkers were already skeptical of the entire genre. They knew these were edifying parables, not literal history. You know, MythVision has never had the luxury of preaching to the choir. I don't stand up like a cult leader, declare something as truth, and watch people nod along because it confirms what they already believe. What I do is much, much harder. I take cherished stories, the ones people think came straight from heaven, and show they're actually stitched together from older myths and common tropes. That's called swimming upstream. And when you point out that these tales have human fingerprints all over them, it clashes hard with faith. The result? Cognitive dissonance. Most people inside the faith bubble double down, inventing any excuse they can to keep the story true, even when the evidence says otherwise. Just pay attention to the comment section. Some watching this series will dig in deeper, convinced their sacred book is historical fact, no matter how clearly the evidence I point out says that it isn't. That's not something I can control. I'm not going to lose any sleep over. What I can do is present the evidence with clarity, honesty, and empathy, because I've been on both sides. I know what it feels like to defend these stories as divine, specifically within Christianity, and I also know what it feels like to finally see through them. And for the sincere seeker, the one who actually wants to know the truth, this journey will open their eyes to things about the Qur'an they never knew. and help them see it for what it truly is, a very human book full of very human stories. MythVision is always fighting an uphill battle. I'm not here to play guru, drop a line and have people blindly nod along. My job is much harder. I'm showing that the stories people hold sacred didn't fall from heaven. They were borrowed, recycled, and repackaged, just like the stories in every other culture of the world. But here's the problem. What you don't know can't convince you. If someone has never heard the older material, how could they even recognize the borrowing? That ignorance is the real Goliath I'm up against, and I'm just hoping my little stone of precision can hit the mark. Take Heracles, for example. Most people know the story, that he died on a funeral pyre. But few realize that this legend is built on much older Phoenician traditions about Melkart, Baal, the dying and rising god whose yearly death and rebirth rituals were celebrated in Tyre. Without knowing those Phoenician stories, you'd never see the fingerprints of Melkart all over the Heracles myth. The same is true for the Bible. I've been working with a scholar, Mark G. Bilby, a classicist New Testament scholar, who's shown how the book of Acts borrows from the ancient Greek stories of Orestes and Iphigenia. Sounds wild, right? But to even begin to see it, you'd first have to know the book of Acts inside and out, understand that early Christians freely imitated stories outside of their Jewish tradition, recognize that Acts' author almost certainly had access to these Greek plays. And most importantly, you'd have to actually know the stories of Orestes and Iphigenia in the first place. Only then can you spot the parallels. Sometimes we even find direct linguistic echoes that make the case stronger. Other times, we can't prove a one-to-one borrowing, but we can still see that the material belongs to the same genre. Like if I say, a man in a cape steps out of a phone booth and flies into the sky, you should instantly know we're in the comic book territory. Myths, legends, and hagiographies work the same way. This is why showing the Qur'an reuses older stories isn't easy. Most Muslims have never been taught the earlier legends. So when I say the sleepers in the cave story in the Qur'an is lifted straight out of the Christian tale from centuries earlier, it sounds shocking. But once you know the Christian legend and then compare it to the Qur'an's version, the connection becomes undeniable. By the end of this episode, you'll see it clearly. Muhammad didn't reveal history. He recycled a legend, and yet today, millions believe it actually happened. That's not just wrong, it's myth mistaken for fact. First, let's listen to Ashab al-Kahf, Companions of the Cave, from Quran chapter 18, verses 19 through 26, Sahih International. For those who have never heard this story, you need to pay attention. You'll understand and see the significance when we look at the older story from the Christians. For those who have heard the story, pay attention, because then you're going to notice the same. Or have you thought that the companions of the cave and the inscription were among our signs of wonder? Mention when the youths retreated to the cave and said, "Our Lord, grant us from yourself mercy and prepare for us from our fair right guidance." So we cast the cover of sleep over their ears within the cave for a number of years. Then we awakened them, that we might show which of the two factions was most precise in calculating what extent they had remained in time. It is we who relate to you, O Muhammad, their story in truth. Indeed, they were youths who believed in their Lord, and we increased them in guidance. And we made firm their hearts when they stood up and said, "Our Lord is the Lord of the heavens and the earth." Never will we invoke besides him any deity. We would have certainly spoken then an excessive transgression. These our people have taken besides him deities. Why do they not bring for worship of them a clear authority? And who is more unjust than one who invents about Allah a lie? The youth said to one another, "And when you have withdrawn from them and that which they worship other than Allah, retreat to the cave. Your Lord will spread out for you of his mercy and will prepare for you from your affair facility. And had you seen the sun when it rose inclining away from their cave on the right, and when it set passing away from them on the left, while they lay within an open space thereof, that was from the signs of Allah. He whom Allah guides is the rightly guided, but he whom he leaves astray, never will you find from him a protecting guide. And you would think them awake while they were asleep, and we returned them to the right and to the left, while their dog stretched his forelegs at the entrance. If you had looked at them, you would have turned from them in flight, and been filled by them with terror. And similarly, we awakened them that they might question one another. Said a speaker from among them, "How long have you remained here?" They said, "We have remained here a day or part of a day." They said, "Your Lord is most knowing of how long you remained. So send one of you with this silver coin of yours to the city, and let him look to which is the best of food, and bring you provision from it, and let him be cautious, and let no one be aware of you. Indeed, if they come to know of you, they will stone you or return you to their religion, and never would you succeed then ever." And similarly, we caused them to be found, that they who found them would know that the promise of Allah is truth, and that the hour there is no doubt. That was when they disputed among themselves about their affair, and then said, "Construct over them a structure. Their Lord is most knowing about them." Said those who prevailed in the matter, "We will surely take for ourselves over them as masjid." They will say there were 3, the 4th of them being their dog. And they will say there were 5, the 5th of them being their dog, guessing at the unseen. And they will say there were 7, and 8 of them was their dog. Say, "My Lord is most knowing of their number. None knows them except a few. So do not argue about them except with an obvious argument, and do not inquire about them among the spectators from anyone. And never say of anything, 'Indeed, I will do that tomorrow,' except when adding, 'if Allah wills.' And remember your Lord when you forget it, and say, 'Perhaps my Lord will guide me to what is nearer than this, to right conduct.' And they remained in their cave 300 years and exceeded by 9. Say, Allah is most knowing of how long they remained. He is the unseen aspects of the heavens and the earth. How seeing is He, and how hearing. They have not besides Him any protector, and He shares not His legislation with anyone." This is the Quran's version of the story. And we're told about a group of young men, maybe 3, maybe 5, maybe 7, only Allah knows. That's a strange thing to say, isn't it? Supposedly, this story came straight from Allah, delivered through the angel Gabriel to Muhammad. But if that's the case, why would Allah say He's the only one who knows the number? Isn't He the one telling the story in the first place? That little contradiction is our first clue that what we're dealing with here isn't revelation. It's a hand-me-down legend. In Quran 18:13, the wording is, "We relate to you their story in truth." The we, Nanu, here is the Quranic royal we, the divine voice Allah uses when speaking in revelation. In Islamic tradition, this always refers to Allah Himself, not angels, not Muhammad, not humans. This raises obvious red flags in the narrative. But here's how the story goes. These young men lived in a city full of idol worship. They refused to bow down to many gods and insisted on worshiping the one true God. To escape persecution, they hid inside a cave, along with their faithful dog, who protected the entrance. Don't forget the dog, because this is going to be seriously important later. God then caused them to fall into a miraculous sleep, not for one night, not for a week, but for centuries. The Quran says 300 years, plus a little more. When they finally woke up, they thought they'd only been out for part of a day. One of them went to buy food, but the coins he carried were so old that people instantly knew something supernatural had happened. Word spread quickly. These men had been preserved for hundreds of years. The Quran presents their story as a sign of God's power, a proof of resurrection and of the coming last day. And yet notice what it leaves blurry: their exact number? Was it 3, 5, 7 with a dog? The Quran doesn't commit. Instead, it emphasizes only God knows. And that's exactly the problem. If God was truly the one revealing this story, without looking at the earlier legend, wouldn't he already know and tell you? This odd hesitation is the crack in the story that lets us see what's really going on. Muhammad didn't receive a brand new revelation from heaven. He was recycling an old legend already famous before the Quran. And guess what? There are many versions floating around with 3 sleepers, 5 sleepers, 7 sleepers, and sometimes even different numbers than those. So now let's immediately hear the closest parallel to the Quran. That is the Syriac Acts of the 7 Sleepers of Ephesus. And we're going to hear a translation from E.W. Brooks. In the days of Emperor Decius, there were 7 young men at Ephesus: Maximilian, Malchus, Martinian, Dionysius, John, Serapion, and Constantine. When persecution broke out against the Christians, they refused to sacrifice to idols. To escape, they fled into a cave on Mount Silion, taking with them only a little bread. Pause for 1 second. In later tradition of this story among the Christians, their dog, named Varacanus or Kitmir in later Arabic tradition, followed them and lay down at the entrance of the cave, refusing to leave them, guarding them. Now, resume the older story. When Decius heard of their hiding place, he ordered the cave to be sealed with stones, so that they would perish inside. But God, who guards his faithful, caused a deep sleep to fall upon them, and they slept in that cave for 372 years, knowing nothing of time passing. In the reign of Theodosius the Younger, when disputes arose in the church about the resurrection of the dead, God willed to reveal the truth by awakening the sleepers. He stirred them from their slumber, and they arose as if from a single night's rest. They prayed together and sent Malchus into the city with coins of silver to buy bread. When he entered, he was astonished to see crosses set upon the gates, for the city was now Christian. When he offered his ancient coins, the bakers were amazed, for they bore the image of Decius long dead. News spread quickly, and the bishops of Ephesus and the emperor himself came to the cave. The 7 told their story, bearing witness that God had indeed power to raise the dead, for they themselves had been preserved as a sign. After this testimony, they bowed their heads, and once more they fell asleep in death until the final resurrection. Wow. There's the story in a nutshell. But what is happening here? In the 3rd century, under Emperor Decius, in 249 to 251 AD, Christians are being hunted down and forced to bow before pagan gods. A group of brave young men in Ephesus refuse. Instead, they sneak away into the mountains, crawl into a cave, and promptly fall asleep, in later tradition, with a dog, which will become significant in a bit. Decius finds out, walls them inside, and that should have been the end of their story. But instead of dying, they drift into a miraculous slumber that lasts not 1 night, not 1 year, but over 3 centuries. This is odd because anyone calculating the time between the death of Decius and the reign of Theodosius II, it calculates roughly to 157 years. So the chronology doesn't add up. In later 13th century, Jacobus de Voragine calculated it to 196 years. Many scholars have given different explanations for why the legend says 372 years. From people making it longer to sound greater, you know how legends work. The number may be symbolic. A scribe accidentally copied the numbers wrong, and then this became the standard number that was passed along in the tradition, and other reasons. But in the story, we fast forward to the reign of the Christian emperor Theodosius II in the mid-400s AD. The wall sealing the cave collapses, and the young men wake up thinking they've just had a nap. One heads into town to buy bread, but when he pulls out coins from Decius's era, people panic. They think he's uncovered buried treasure. When the bishop investigates, the truth hits. These guys are living proof of the resurrection. And then, after delivering their miracle, they fall asleep again, this time for good, until the resurrection. The story wasn't just a miracle tale. It was a direct rebuttal to a bishop named Theodore of Agi, who denied the bodily resurrection during the 430s to 440s AD. The sleeper's resurrection nap was the ultimate mic drop to prove him wrong. This is exactly why this story was invented to begin with. It was a legend to debunk a bishop with heretical doctrine. You see, this story circulated within 10 to 20 years of this Christian debate when it was actually invented. This, ladies and gentlemen, is classic hagiography. But before we spell out what hagiography is, let's briefly compare these stories to raise a few eyebrows. What do we have? 1. Group of young men in both stories. 2. Refusal of idol worship, affirmation of one God in both stories. 3. They're pursued by authorities or persecution in both stories, both the Qur'an and early Christian stories. 4. They're taking hiding in a cave in both. 5. Dog guarding the cave in both traditions after the Qur'an's written in the 7th century. There's a 5th century quote of a post-7th century document that says that there was a traveler telling the story with the dog in it. But you'll see later that scholars kind of question this. At the end of the day, the dog guarding the cave is original, or most scholars think, a unique attribute in the Quran. But the earlier story from the Christians has some divine figure guarding the cave. 6. Falling into miraculous centuries-long sleep. This is an important element we're going to show soon, but both stories have them sleeping for hundreds of years. 7. Awakening, confused about how long they'd been asleep. In both stories, the protagonists, the sleepers, have no clue how long they were asleep. They thought they just took a nap real quick. 8. Discovery via old coin. Both stories have them with a very old coin going to buy some food. 9. Locals shocked at the miracle. In both stories, they come to the cave, they're impressed by the miracle, and it proves their theological point. 10. The story becomes a divine sign. Resurrection in Christianity, God's power in Quran, and may imply resurrection when it talks about the time, specifically in the Quran, chapter 18. 11. Ambiguity about their number. Both traditions note it. So you have, in the early Christian traditions, you have this ambiguity about how many sleepers. Sometimes it's 7. Various different ones might have 5 or 3 or 8 or even 9. Whereas in the Quran, it talks about they say there's 3, they say there's 5, they say there's 7. You see this ambiguity in both traditions, which should be a red flag. 12. Final, return to sleep after their message is delivered. So they all go to sleep until they await the final resurrection in the end. And this is in both stories. So put together, that is a mountain of overlap. Way too much to brush off as mere coincidence. Now, what is hagiography? Hagiography means writing about the lives of saints. But it isn't real history. It's religious storytelling meant to inspire faith, defend beliefs, and teach lessons. The tale of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus is a perfect example. 7 young Christians supposedly hid from persecution, fell asleep in a cave, and miraculously woke nearly 200 years later if you take the literal chronology, to prove that resurrection was real. This wasn't written as fact, but as fictive hagiography, a legend created in the 5th century to settle debates about whether resurrection was a literal or symbolic body. It's not eyewitness history. It's a theological story dressed up as a miracle. And pretty soon, pilgrims were flocking to their cave. A church was built on the very spot. See, archaeologists have actually uncovered it in the 1930s. The cult of the seven sleepers spread like wildfire in Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Arabic, Ethiopic, and even Sogdian. By the Middle Ages, everyone knew about them from France to Persia. That's a massive chunk of the known world at the time that knew about this. Get this, this trope wasn't new to the Christians either. So Muslims can kind of go, okay, let's hear what he has to say. Let's see what kind of evidence he shows that the Christians themselves may do this. The idea of miraculous long sleep already floated around Jewish, Greek, and Babylonian traditions. Jeremiah's servant Abimelech was said to have slept through the Babylonian exile. We can read this in the ancient Jewish text, 4th Baruch, where Jeremiah's servant Abimelech is said to have fallen asleep for 66 years, snoozing straight through the Babylonian exile. When he finally woke up, the basket of figs he had with him was still fresh, a miracle proving God would preserve his people during the exile for their return, the same way he preserved Abimelech and the figs. This isn't history, it's theology, a symbolic miracle tale about divine protection, hope, and the certainty of return, not a literal eyewitness account of something that actually happened. The Talmud tells of a man named Honi who snoozed through 70 years. Here's how it goes. In the Babylonian Talmud, Ta'anit 23a, we meet Honi the circle drawer, a Jewish sage famous for his prayers for rain. One day, he sees a man planting a carob tree and asks, "How long until it bears fruit?" The man replies, 70 years. Honi wonders if the man will live to see it. And the man answers, "Just as my ancestors planted for me, I plant for my children." Honi then falls into a deep sleep covered by rock and doesn't wake for 70 years. When he opens his eyes, the carob tree is full grown and another man is gathering its fruit, the planter's grandson. Honi realizes the truth. He has slept through an entire lifetime. Even his donkey has multiplied into generations of offspring. He rushes home only to find his own son dead and his grandson alive. He enters the study hall, where scholars are marveling that in Honi's day, every debate was clear. When Honi declares, "I am Honi," no one believes him. Alone and unrecognized, he prays for death, and God grants it. The Talmud closes with Rava's haunting reflection, either companionship or death. The meaning is clear. This isn't history, but a parable. The 70 years mirror Israel's exile. The carob tree shows that we plant not for ourselves, but for the future. And Honi's lonely end teaches that a life cut off from community is no life at all. Some scholars think the oldest long sleep story we know doesn't come from the Bible or the Qur'an. It comes from ancient Greece, from Lives of the Eminent Philosophers by Diogenes Laertius, Book 1, Chapter 10, sections 109 to 110. Let's read it. One day, he, Epimenides, was sent into the country by his father to look for a stray sheep, and at noon he turned out of the way and went to sleep in a cave, where he slept for 57 years. After this, he got up and went in search of the sheep, thinking he had been asleep only a short time. And when he could not find it, he came to the farm and found everything changed and another owner in possession. Then he went back to the town in utter perplexity, and there, on entering his own home, he fell in with people who wanted to know who he was. At length, he found his younger brother, now an old man, and learnt the truth from him. In this source, we meet Epimenides of Crete, a semi-legendary seer from centuries ago. Diogenes Laertius tells that one day he wandered into a cave while looking for a lost sheep, and didn't just nap, he slept for 57 years. When he finally woke, everything had changed. The sheep was gone, new people lived where they used to live, even his own home felt foreign. only his elderly, younger brother could explain, "You've slept for decades." In that single surreal moment, Epimenides wasn't just waking up, he was reborn, transformed into a man touched by destiny and divine wisdom, destined to be revered as a prophet. You know the famous line, "For in him we live and move and have our being," in Acts 17:28, is most often traced to Epimenides of Crete by scholars. Academics say this ancient long sleep story is the granddaddy of all such legends, the earliest recorded example of a miracle sleep that reawakens belief in a higher calling that is preserved today. But is this Epimenides story the oldest? As some scholars think, this might just be false. The long sleeper motif goes all the way back to Mesopotamia. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, Utnapishtim challenges the hero to stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights if he wants eternal life. Gilgamesh fails, falls asleep right away, and wakes up a week later. To prove how long he's been out, Utnapishtim points to 7 loaves of bread baked daily beside him, now stale and moldy. It took a day to bake a loaf of bread in those days, proving that Gilgamesh was knocked out for 7 days with 7 loaves, because when he woke up, he believed that he had just closed his eyes for just a second. Even this far back, this idea of Gilgamesh sleeping signified he was not immortal, and sleep represented the twin brother of death. What makes it so striking is where this happens. Gilgamesh has just crossed through the cosmic mountain, where the sun itself passes from the underworld to the world of the living. He entered the borderland between mortal and divine, the very place heroes in myth always try to breach. And just like other heroes who dare to pass that boundary, Gilgamesh finds the door slammed shut. This is significant for the sleeper story in the Qur'an. We will see that in a minute. It's the first time we see the miracle sleep idea used to test a human against the divine. Later Greek thinkers picked up the theme. Aristotle briefly mentions Sardinian heroes who wake up without realizing how much time has passed. And Stoic writers loved these kinds of paradox stories, marvels that carried a moral lesson. The most famous Greek example is Epimenides of Crete, who, depending on the source, slept in a cave for 40 or even 57 years before waking as a divinely inspired sage, a prophet. From Babylon to Greece, the long sleeper was a powerful way to explore human limits, divine power, and the shock of time lost. So, what did the Christians do? They took an old trope, the long sleeper, we've already seen in Gilgamesh, Epimenides, Abimelech, and Honi, and gave it a fresh spin. They plugged it straight into their theological debates about resurrection. Instead of just being a marvel or a moral lesson, the story of the sleepers of Ephesus became the ultimate proof text. See? God can preserve bodies through the ages. Resurrection is bodily. Scholars still debate what language the 7 sleeper story first appeared in, Syriac or Greek. However, most think Greek came first. But by the 5th and 6th centuries, Syriac poets like Jacob of Saru were already retelling it, and church historians were spreading it across the Christian world. We've got manuscripts in London, Paris, Berlin, and St. Petersburg with different versions. Some say 7 youths, others 8. From there, the tale jumped into Islam, where it shows up in the Surah Al-Kahf, and then spread even further into Persian, Kyrgyz, and Tatar traditions. The sleepers became a cross-cultural blockbuster, proof of resurrection from Syria to Central Asia. But here's the problem. The story was never consistent. Some Christians in Nahran swore there were 3. Eastern Syrians, Nestorians, said 5. Other versions insisted 7 or 8. When Islam picked it up, the confusion only grew. The historian Al-Tabari records versions with 7, 8, even 9, and always with a dog. That dog became legendary in Islamic lore, called Kitmir or sometimes Ar-Rakim. But Al-Tabari also admits Ar-Rakim wasn't a dog at all. It might have been the name of an inscription on a plaque at the cave's entrance. That kind of confusion screams legend, not history. Simply put, if you're retelling a story and can't even agree whether a character is a dog or an inscription, you're not dealing with fact. You're watching tradition or legend in motion. And get this, in the 3rd century world where this story is set, dogs weren't cute companions or man's best friend. They were working animals for shepherds and hunters, not holy mascots for saints. Yet the Qur'an doubles down on the uncertainty, saying, "They will say 3 in their dog, 5 in their dog, or 7 in their dog. Say, my Lord knows best." Why would Allah reveal a story only to hedge the details with "only God knows"? Because this wasn't revelation. It was a human story already circulating in multiple versions, picked up and retold in the Qur'an. The shifting numbers and the mystery dog show us exactly what this is: folklore dressed up as scripture. Believe it or not, the earliest versions of the 7 Sleepers story didn't have a dog at all. In the mid-5th century, Syriac writers like Jacob of Saru retold the tale from an earlier lost Greek source right after Theodosius II, and in those accounts, it's just the young men, no loyal hound, no furry guardian at the cave. The dog doesn't show up in the earliest versions of the Sleeper's tale. In Jacob of Saru's homily, around 521 AD, there's a divine watcher, but no canine companion. The first time we actually see a dog is in a Latin pilgrim text, De Situ Terra Sancta, attributed to Theodosius in 518 to 531 AD, which mentions the 7 sleeping brothers and the puppy Veracanus at their feet. But here's the problem. The manuscripts of this text are much later, and many scholars suspect the dog line was added after the Qur'an had already spread the legend with its watchful hound at the cave's entrance. In other words, the Qur'an may be the earliest secure witness for the dog in the story, and this detail likely trickled back into Christian retellings from there. This is a common feature in legend, mythology, and other folklore. The stories evolve and change as people tell the story across cultures. I can already hear the willingness of Muslim apologists granting that the Christians definitely borrowed from the Quran. Yeah, that's right, they borrowed from the Quran. But saying Muhammad borrowed from the Christians, or that Muhammad learned this story from other humans, and not Allah, that's stretching too far for them. By the late 6th century, Gregory of Tours retells the sleeper story in Glory of the Martyrs, though the dog isn't actually present in our surviving texts. Later traditions in the Latin West certainly adopt him. Over time, writers like Paul the Deacon and Jacobus de Voragine made the dog standard issue. So what looks like a quaint medieval flourish may in fact be a Quranic innovation that later seeped into Christian retellings. The fact that these details continue to pass from one version into the other version is evidence of the relationship this story clearly had from Christian startings to the Quran back into Christian tellings. By the time we reach the Quran in the 7th century, the dog is baked into the legend. Surah 18 even highlights him in the number debate. 3 in their dog, the 4th, 5 in their dog, the 6th, 7 in their dog, the 8th. The trail is crystal clear. In the 5th century Syriac Mesopotamia, no dog, but we do get a guardian at the cave's entrance. Late 5th to 6th century Byzantium, no dog yet. 6th century Latin West, likely or probably no dog. The evidence is suggested from later sources. 7th century Arabia, Quran locks in the dog. Let's pause for some doggy context. In the ancient Near East, dogs weren't cuddly house pets curled up on the couch. They carried heavy, symbolic weight. Dogs were liminal creatures, beings of the threshold and borderlands. They marked the border between purity and impurity, human and non-human, life and death. In Mesopotamian, Hittite, and Greek rituals, a polluted person could literally pass their impurity onto a dog, which was then sacrificed and buried. In other words, dogs were spiritual scapegoats. These rites were common across the Levant, especially in Persian-ruled Judea between the 5th and 3rd centuries BCE. Dogs also lived in the cultural imagination as liminal beings, but you might wonder what that is. So, a liminal being is a creature or figure that lives on the thresholds, not fully one thing, not fully another, but stuck in between. Ancient writers filled the map's edges with weird hybrids, and one of the coolest, and even creepiest, were the dog-headed people, the Kinokephali. It's pretty wild. Herodotus, writing around the 5th century BC in his Histories, chapter 4, paragraph 191, puts them in far-off lands of Libya. Ctesias of Cnidus, in the 5th to 4th centuries BC, Indica fragments, gives one of the earliest detailed accounts of the Kinokephali in India, describing them as people who bark, wear animal skins, and hunt game. Pliny the Elder in around 70 AD repeats it. Augustine, early 5th century AD, in his City of God, raises the question, if such beings really exist, do they descend from Adam and Noah like the rest of humanity? Reflecting how widespread belief in them was. Even the Alexander romance sends Alexander to those borderlands, where humanity blurs into the monstrous. Exactly the kind of liminal zone story ancient audiences loved. Why does this matter for the Qur'an? Surat al-Kahf 18 includes dual Qur'an, often linked by scholars to the Alexander tradition, traveling to the world's ends and dealing with Gog and Magog, classic edge of the earth, material that echoes the same border myth energy as the dog-headed peoples. It's the same storytelling toolbox. Push the hero to the fringes, meet the strange, test truth at the threshold. The Alexander to Quran connection deserves its own deep dive. We will save that for the next video. Also, in one of the strangest early Christian legends, Saint Christopher wasn't always the kindly giant with a staff we see in modern icons. In the 5th to 6th century Coptic tale, he began as Reprobus, a towering, dog-headed man who ferried travelers across a dangerous river by carrying them on his shoulders. One day, he lifted a small child, but as he struggled under the weight, the child revealed himself as Christ. That moment transformed Reprobus into Christopher, the Christ-bearer, and made him the patron saint of travelers. It's a perfect example of the liminal dog-man motif, part human, part beast, standing at the threshold of river and road, carrying souls safely from one world to another. But the most powerful symbolism was at the threshold of life and death. The Egyptians already had their own guardian at the gate of death, Anubis, the jackal-headed god. Dogs and jackals prowled the desert edges where tombs were dug, scavenging graves. The Egyptians flipped this fear into faith. The same animal that could desecrate the dead became the divine protector of the dead. In the Book of the Dead, Anubis guides souls into the Hall of Judgment, standing at the scales where the heart is weighed against truth. In the myth of Osiris, 2400 BC, pyramid text and later ones, it's Anubis who embalms and guards the murdered god, setting the model for every burial to follow. He's both scavenger and savior, terrifying and sacred, standing at the threshold between life and death. Then we have the Greeks and Romans' Cerberus, as the monstrous hound sprawled across the gates of Hades, the living barrier between the world of the living and the dead. This is why Heracles' final labor was to drag Cerberus up from the underworld. To do it, he had to cross into Hades, hell itself, guided by Hermes and Athena, and face death's watchdog head-on. Heracles didn't kill Cerberus, he overpowered him, hauled him into the daylight, and then returned him to his post. Only a hero like Heracles could break through death's threshold and come back. Cerberus wasn't just a monster, he was the very symbol of the boundary Heracles had to cross and survive. There's a place in Virgil's Aeneid, Book 6, where Aeneas descends into the underworld and confronts Cerberus, the monstrous hound of Hades. Huge Cerberus sprawls, monstrous, in a cave opposite, guarding the entrance. There's a dog guarding the entrance, filling the air with his triple-throated howling. The Sibyl, seeing the snakes bristling on his neck, throws him a honey cake with soporific herbs and drugged with honey. He opens his 3 ravenous gullets in hunger and swallows the sop, stretching his immense back on the ground and sinking all his monstrous bulk in sleep. He lies sprawling across the whole cave. Aeneas seizes the entrance, and, once the guard is buried in sleep, he slips through the opening. This sounds so familiar to the dog in the Qur'an cave, literally guarding the front. Keep that in mind. One of the oldest dogs at the gate stories comes from India. In the Rig Veda, around 1200 to 1000 BC, the god of death, Yama, isn't alone. He's flanked by 2 terrifying 4-eyed dogs. These hounds, called the Sons of Sarama, stand guard on the road to the afterlife. They're liminal beings, part guardian, part guide. For the righteous, they help lead the soul safely to Yama's realm. For others, they're fierce watchdogs who keep the living out and the dead in. A hymn in the Rig Veda, 10:14, prays, "May the 2 4-eyed, broad-nosed, brindled dogs, the messengers of Yama, guard us here from harm. May they give us shelter and safety, that we may see the sun again." Long before Cerberus or the Quran's cave dog, the Vedic tradition already imagined death itself guarded by loyal, watchful hounds. For this reason, scholars think the Greek Cerberus may echo a Proto-Indo-European underworld dog, since Vedic text, like Rig Veda 10:14, mention the 2 dogs of Yama, guardians of the road to the land of the dead. The Zoroastrians had one of the most striking dog rituals of all, called Sagdid, literally the dog's gaze. When someone actually died, a dog had to be brought to look at the body. Until the dog's eyes confirmed it, the death wasn't ritually recognized. Why? Because in Zoroastrian belief, dogs were guardians of purity and protectors against the demon of corruption that tried to seize a corpse. In their cosmology, even the bridge into the afterlife, the Chenvat Bridge, was guarded by dogs, standing at the threshold between this world and the next. Once again, we find the same archetype, the dog as the gatekeeper of death, the loyal sentinel at the ultimate borderland. This imagery carried into Jewish and Christian writings. A rabbinic commentary on Ecclesiastes, probably composed in the early medieval period around 500 to 600 AD, declared, "In the world to come, dogs will open gates." And in Christian Apocrypha, the dog literally became a preacher. In the Acts of Peter, written around the 2nd century AD, a talking dog is sent as Peter's messenger to confront the magician Simon Magus. And the dog ran away at once and went into the midst of the people who were with Simon, and lifting his front legs, he said with a very loud voice, "Simon Magus, Peter, who stands at the door, bids you to come outside in public, for he says, on your account have I come to Rome. You shall be accursed, enemy and destroyer of the way of Christ's truth. He shall punish your iniquities which you have done, and you shall be in the outer darkness." Having thus spoken, the dog fell at the feet of Peter and expired. We also have a very strange story from the Acts of Andrew, written around 150 to 200 AD, that further strengthens this mythic idea, where the apostle confronts demonic dogs rising from a graveyard. After this, he went to Nicaea, where were 7 devils living among the tombs by the wayside, who at noon stoned passerbys and had killed many. He commanded the demons to appear. They came in the form of dogs. Now look again at the very mouth of the cave in the Qur'an, and you will see a chilling detail. "And you would think them awake, though they were asleep, and we turned them to the right and to the left, while their dog stretched out its forelegs at the entrance. If you had looked at them, you would have turned away in flight and been filled with terror of them." Qur'an chapter 18 verse 18. Later commentators tried to soften this, turning the dog into a pious pet with a name, Kitmir. But in its raw Quranic form, the image is terrifying. A beast sprawled at the cave's threshold, limbs extended as if to bar the way, isn't a gentle guardian. It is the classic hellhound, the sentinel of death's gate. Just as Cerberus in Virgil's Aeneid sprawls across the whole cave of Hades, or Anubis patrols Egyptian cemeteries as jackal-headed guide of souls, the Quran's dog functions as a liminal guardian. Its posture is a barricade, a warning. The entrance is forbidden. The text itself insists that any passerby would flee in terror. In other words, this is not a cozy den, but a cosmic threshold, the cave of the dead. The dog marks it as such. That the Quran introduces this ancient motif, unique to its version of the story, is a red flag. It is tugging directly at a long-standing mythological string, reshaping the hellhound of the underworld into the sign of God's sovereignty, but myth-making all the same. From scapegoat to gatekeeper, from psychopomp to prophet, the dog was always the creature of the threshold, guarding the doorways, liminal states, and even the passage between worlds. The Quran's telling of the sleepers of the cave gives us another detail that doesn't appear in any Christian version of the story. We are told that when the sun rises, it bends away from the cave on one side, and when it sets, it passes on the other. Meanwhile, the sleepers themselves are turned from right to left, as if they are moving in rhythm with the sun's daily journey. You may see the sun when it rises, turning away from their cave on the right, and when it sets, passing them by on the left, while they lay in its hollow. That is one of God's signs. Quran chapter 18 verse 17. And then we turn them to the right and the left. This is an ordinary slumber. It's a cosmic drama. The cave isn't sealed with stones as in the Christian accounts. Instead, it is open to the horizon, exactly where the sun begins its descent each night into the realm beneath. The sleepers lie exposed at the mouth of death itself. To an ancient audience, this imagery would have been unmistakable. In the mythic worldview of the ancient Near East, caves and horizons weren't just geographical features. They were cosmic thresholds, doorways between the world of the living and the land of the dead. The sun didn't simply vanish at night. It traveled underneath the earth, returning at dawn. The cave where the Quran's sleepers rest is placed on that very road, where the sun itself descends into darkness. This vision fits into a much older set of stories. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero reaches the mountain of Mashu, where terrifying scorpion men guard the gates of the sun. At the mountain of Mashu, he arrived. Scorpion men guard its gate, whose terror is awesome. Their glance is death. Their dread is immense, overwhelming the mountains. They guard the rising and setting of the sun. Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 9, lines 38 through 44. Damn if that doesn't sound like the dogs at the cave in the Qur'an. Their job is to block mortals from entering the road that leads down into the underworld. The same road the sun god Shamash travels each day and night. Ancient hymns to Shamash describe him scanning the earth by day and crossing the broad sea whose foundation is the netherworld by night. You climb to the mountains surveying the earth. You suspend from the heavens the circle of the lands. You care for all the peoples of the lands, and everything that Ea, king of the counselors, had created is entrusted to you. Whatever has breath you shepherd without exception. You are their keeper in upper and lower regions. Regularly and without cease you traverse the heavens. Every day you pass over the broad earth. Shepherd of that beneath, keeper of that above. You, Shamash, direct. You are the light of everything. You never fail to cross the wide expanse of sea, the depth of which the Igigi know not. Shamash, your glare reaches down into the abyss, so that monsters of the deep behold your light. Among all the Igigi, there is none who toils but you, none who is supreme like you in the whole pantheon of gods. At your rising, the gods of the land assemble. Your fierce glare covers the land. Of all the lands of varied speech, you know their plans, you scan their way. The whole of mankind bows to you. Shamash, the universe longs for your light. Great Hymn to Shamash, translated by W.G. Lambert. Ishtar too follows this path in her famous descent into that cave, the underworld, a tomb. One of the oldest Mesopotamian texts begins, "To the land of no return, the region of darkness, Ishtar, the daughter of Sin, set her mind. To the house which none leave who have entered it, to the road whose journey has no return, to the house whose entrance are deprived of light." Descent of Ishtar, lines 1 through 10. She is brought back to the land of the living after descending the 7 gates into hell, Hades, the underworld. Even in Greek tradition, the same idea appears. When Demeter searches for her lost daughter Persephone, it is Helios, the sun itself, who reveals where she has gone, down into the shadowy world through the hidden entrance of Hades. Helios, the Shining One, said, "Queen Demeter, daughter of fair-haired Rhea, you shall know, for I pity you in your grief." It was Adonis who carried her off in his golden chariot into the misty gloom, through the plain into the shadowy land of the dead. Homeric Hymn to Demeter, lines 75 to 85, written around the 6th to 7th century BC. The symbolism is consistent. The sun marks the way. The cave or horizon is the portal, and those who pass through it enter death's domain. This wasn't just happening in Mesopotamia or Greece. Arabia had its own version of this cosmic system. Al-Uzza, one of the great goddesses of the pre-Islamic Arabia, was worshipped at a stone beetle in Nakhla, not far from Mecca. She was equated with Ishtar and Isis, and in the Nabatean Petra, she was the consort of the chief god Dushara. Archaeology suggests her cult may have centered in the Temple of the Winged Lions. In Syria, the solar mountain god Elagabalus was represented by a black conical stone. Roman historian Herodian writes, "In the middle of the temple stood an enormous stone, round at the base and tapering to a point. The people believe this stone to have fallen from heaven, and they revere it as if it were sent by the gods." And at the heart of Mecca itself stood the Kaaba, surrounded by idols but centered on a sacred stone, the Black Stone. Long before Islam, Arab tribes revered it, likely as a meteorite, a stone fallen from heaven, embodying divine presence. When Muhammad cleansed the Kaaba of idols, if this story can be trusted because it isn't narrated until 80 to 100 years after the Qur'an had been compiled. The black stone remained. The Qur'an never mentions the destruction of idols. Ibn Ishaq reports, when the Messenger of God entered Mecca on the day of its conquest, he found around the Kaaba 360 idols, which the people had been worshipping. He struck them with his staff and recited, "Truth has come and falsehood has vanished. Indeed, falsehood is bound to vanish." The black stone's meaning was reframed, but its mythic grammar was the same. The stone was the cosmic axis, a fragment of heaven anchoring the horizon of earth. So when we read the Quran's story of the cave, it isn't pulling imagery out of thin air. The building blocks of myth were already floating all around Arabia. Caves as gates to the underworld, the sun as traveler through life and death, sacred stones as embodiments of divine presence fallen from heaven, mountains as cosmic thrones of the gods, from Ishtar to Shamash, from Gilgamesh to Demeter, and from Al-Uzza to the black stone of the Kaaba. The imagery is consistent. The Quran takes this ancient mythic language and reshuffles it into a monotheistic key. What looks like a story about a few pious youths is actually something far deeper. The echoes of Mesopotamia, Greece, Syria, Petra, and Mecca itself. The Quran's cave is the same old gate of death, its sun the same old cosmic traveler, its dog the same old hellhound sentinel. Arabia didn't invent this symbolic grammar, but by the time of Muhammad, it was already in the air, woven into shrines, stones, and stories. The Quran simply tuned it to a new melody. We can give endless data to show you these mythic symbols, but I think it's important to return to paralleling the sleeper stories, specifically the Syriac Acts of the Seven Sleepers version. Look at this parallel chart of the obvious parallels between both of these stories, keeping in mind that the Christian version is literally 150 years older than the Quran. Sleepers in the Cave, Christian versus Quranic versions. The feature is the far left, Christian version is in the middle, and the Quranic version is on the right. The setting, cave outside Ephesus in the Roman Empire. Cave called Al-Kahf. Location, unspecified, but later traditions suggest Jordan or Turkey. Persecutor, Emperor Decius in 249 to 251 of the Common Era, orders them entombed for refusing to worship idols. On the right, a nameless ruler opposes their monotheism. No emperor is named, no specific martyrdom narrative. It's as if they wanted to strip those details to keep it generic. Faith of youths. Explicitly Christian, baptized believers confessing Christ. Described only as righteous monotheist, not identified as Christian or Jewish in the Quran. Number of sleepers. Usually 7 youths, but some traditions vary. The Quran deliberately leaves the number ambiguous. They will say 3 or 5 or 7. Say, "My Lord knows best." The dog. Well, in this particular earlier version, there is no dog, but the tradition names the dog Kitmir, depicted in Persian art and medieval miniatures later. But technically, that earlier Syriac version does not have a dog, and in the Quran, the dog mentioned explicitly. Guarding the cave, Islamic lore develops mystical significance for the dog, sometimes talismanic. Duration of sleep. Well, it varies. 373 years, Gregory of Tours, but 196 years for the Golden Legend that comes later. And in the Quran, they remained 300 years and add 9. So 309 lunar years, 300 solar years. Awakening. Awoke in Christian Ephesus under Emperor Theodosius II, proof of the resurrection of the body. Awoke after centuries, their story functions as a sign from God, not tied to resurrection doctrine, but to divine testing. Purpose of miracle. To prove resurrection and reward for Christian faith under persecution. In the Quran, to provide a sign of God's power refuting polytheism and claims that Allah has a son. Narrative emphasis. Christian martyrdom, endurance under Decius, vindication under Theodosius. The world transformed from pagan to Christianity, technically. In the Quran, ambiguity of number, duration, and setting focus on mystery and divine lesson rather than historical detail. Transmission. It originated in Syriac Christian homily by Jacob of Saru, spread in Latin. Of course, it was originally in Greek based on scholarship, but it also spread into Greek and later European traditions. And the Quran incorporated into the Quran in the 7th century, showing knowledge of existing Christian tell with unique preserved motifs. Here's the problem. When Muslims insist the story of the sleepers of the cave literally happened, they end up confirming not Islam, but Christianity. Why? Because the story wasn't originally Islamic at all. It was Christian hagiography, a legendary tale that circulated in Syriac, Greek, and Latin long before the Quran was written. And these weren't just any Christians, they were Trinitarian believers who told this story to confirm their doctrine of the bodily resurrection. If the story really happened the way Christians told it, then the Quran isn't bringing us new revelation. It's simply borrowing Christian theology and stamping Islam on it. That's not divine originality, that's second-hand mythology. Now, if Muslim apologists try to flip it and say, no, the Christian version is false, but our Quranic version is the real history, that's actually even worse to me. Think about it. The Quran comes 150 years after the Christian versions were already viral across the Near East in Syriac, Greek, Coptic, and Latin. The Quran removes the emperor's name, deletes the names of the youths, strips away the cross symbolism, basically cutting out all the Christian theology that gave this story its meaning. That looks less like revelation and more like literary editing. If you believe the Christian story didn't happen, why is the Quran reusing the fictional material at all? Why lift a Christian legend only to repurpose it unless you're engaging in theological copy-paste, pretending yours is history building off a fictional story? Absurd. The only consistent, honest position is this. Both stories are myth and hagiography, not history. Christians created it as a theological lesson about resurrection, and the Quran reworked it for its own agenda. To claim otherwise means you have to start accepting every other sleeper or death and resurrection myth as history too. Gilgamesh, Epimenides, Heracles, Anubis, Abimelech, Honi, and yes, the 7 sleepers the Christians told. Nobody does that, because everyone knows those are legends. So let's be honest. The Quran's version of the sleepers is not an eyewitness account. It's not history. It's myth-making. And once you see it for what it is, a theological tale dressed up as a miracle, the illusion collapses. Many modern apologists love to say, the Quran's story of the sleepers of the cave proves it's divine. Muhammad couldn't possibly have known it. But the earliest Muslim historians themselves tell a very different story. Let's hear it straight from them. Ibn Ishaq, our earliest biographer of Muhammad, records that the Quraysh weren't convinced by Muhammad's preaching. He was writing 120 to 130 years after the death of Muhammad. So they went to the Jewish rabbis in Medina to test him. The rabbis gave them 3 questions. One of them, ask him about some young men in ancient times. What happened to them? For theirs is a wonderful tale. Ask him about a mighty wonder who reached the very ends of the earth, the east and the west. Ask him about the Spirit. What is it? If he can tell you these things, then he is indeed a prophet. If he cannot, then he is a forger, liar, and you may do with him as you will. That wondrous tale the rabbis asked about is none other than the legend of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus. In other words, this wasn't new revelation. It was a story Muhammad was challenged to retell. So here's the problem. Why on earth would Jewish rabbis send Muhammad a question about the sleepers in the cave when that's a Christian legend? Well, A few options pop up, none of them flattering for Muslim apologists. Option 1. By the 6th-7th century, the story had gone viral. It wasn't just a Christian tale anymore. It was floating around in Syriac and Arabic communities where Jews, Christians, and Arabs all rubbed shoulders. Maybe the rabbis had heard it too. The problem is, we don't have actually any Jewish sources telling this story. So while you could say it's possible, but it's unproven and even possibly unlikely. Option 2. The whole episode could be a later invention. Muslim storytellers embarrassed that the Quran repeats a well-known Christian legend, and they needed to explain it. The solution was to insert Jewish rabbis as ones who asked about it. Suddenly, it's not Muhammad borrowing from Christian hagiography. Rather, it's a prophetic test. Clever narrative move, but transparently retrofitted. This explanation fits a common pattern. Many Sirah anecdotes serve to explain awkward Quranic content. The issue is, if it's retrofitted, why pick rabbis, Jews, instead of monks, Christians, as the testers? That inconsistency is suspicious. Option 3. The rabbis actually intentionally asked a trick question. They cleverly set a trap for Muhammad. They deliberately dangled a Christian hagiography in front of Muhammad instead of a story from Torah. If he answered their trap by giving the sleeper's tale, they'd say, "Ha! He's just parroting Christian fables." If he didn't, they'd call him a fraud. Either way, Muhammad loses. And what do we see in Surah 18? A vague retelling of the legend, missing all the details Christians knew by heart. If this really was a trap, Muhammad walked right into it. Whichever way you cut it, it doesn't look good. If the story was common folklore, then the Quran is recycling campfire tales. If the rabbis really asked it, then Muhammad got duped by Christian hagiography. If it was invented later, then it's just an apologetic cover story. Option 4. Another scholarly view is that Muslim tradition reinterprets what was originally a criticism, Muhammad parroting legends, into a proof of prophecy. In this reading, the real charge was Muhammad is repeating fables of the ancients from the Quran 25:5, 68:15. And they say, tells of the ancients which he has had written down, they are dictated to him morning and evening. Also, when our verses are recited to him, he says, tells of the ancients. The Sirah rabbi's test story was then invented to flip the charge. The Quran's use of folklore wasn't plagiarism. It was prophecy confirmed by scripture experts. This makes sense of the polemical context, but it also means the tradition itself is historically unreliable. No matter which door you open, you find human fingerprints all over this, not divine revelation. The earliest Muslim sources admit Muhammad didn't introduce the sleeper story as a fresh revelation. Jews and Christians already knew the legend and literally used it as a question to challenge him. The Quran's version in Quran 18 is responsive, not original, a retelling of a tale floating around Arabia in Syriac and Greek. So when modern apologists say there's no way Muhammad could have known this story, they're contradicting their own tradition. The Quran sleeper's tale isn't a divine proof. It's myth, hagiography, and late antique folklore that Muhammad's audience already knew. The only difference, the Quran trims out the Christian details, the emperor's name, the boys' names, the cross symbolism, and reframes it in Islamic terms. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not revelation. That's what experts call redaction. Adapted details, for example. Apologists protest, but the Quran doesn't say they were Christians or mention Jesus. Exactly. That proves adaptation. The Quran strips out the overtly Christian material and recasts the story in Islamic terms. That's how human redactors work. They edit, A divine revelation wouldn't need to recycle a cut-down version of a tale everyone already knew. And the text admits it secondhand. Like literally, the Qur'an itself says they will say 3 and their dog, the 4th, 5 and their dog, the 6th, 7 and their dog, the 8th. Say, my Lord knows best. In other words, the text acknowledges a pre-existing debate and dismisses it as irrelevant. That only makes sense if Muhammad's audience already knew the fuller Christian legends floating around. Another apologetic is to say, archaeology proves the Quran's site in Jordan. Let's talk about the famous Cave of the Sleepers in Jordan, the site Muslim apologists love to point to as proof that the Quran story is historical. The problem, archaeology tells a very different story. Archaeologists have concluded that the El Rakim cave near Amman wasn't some timeless untouched tomb. It was originally a Byzantine church. Later, under the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan in around 705 AD, it was converted into a mosque, and then even renovated again under the Talunids. In other words, what you're looking at is a later Islamic shrine built over a Christian site, not the original home of some miraculous sleepers. Meanwhile, the real heavy-hitting evidence comes from Ephesus. Excavations at the Grotto of the Seven Sleepers in the 1920s uncovered hundreds of burials and inscriptions from the 5th and 6th centuries dedicated to the sleepers, long before the Quran was even written, and it even became a pilgrimage site for Christians. So when apologists point to Jordan and say, look, bones, sarcophagi, even a dog skull, this proves the Quran, the answer is simple. Those are later devotional layers. They prove people venerated the site, not that the story ever happened. And, ladies and gentlemen, here's the kicker. There isn't just one cave. Turkey alone has several sleepers caves, and you'll find others in Syria, Tunisia, even China. When a legend sprouts multiple holy sites, that's a dead giveaway you're looking at folklore diffusion, not hard history. The bottom line is that archaeology doesn't bail out the Quran here. It actually undercuts it. The earliest and best evidence points straight to Christian hagiography in Ephesus, not to a historical miracle later confirmed by Muhammad. The Jordan Cave is just a later Islamic adoption of a story Christians had been telling for centuries. At the end of the day, the people of the cave isn't divine revelation of some real historical account. It's folklore. The evidence is stacked. Classical sources, Syriac homilies, archaeology, comparative mythology, and modern scholarship all agree this was a Christian legend long before the Quran. The Islamic version doesn't stand apart. It simply reshapes the older Syriac story of Jacob of Saru, stripping away Christian details, adding a dog, and retooling it into a sermon on Tawhid. Muslim historians themselves admitted the tale was already known in Arabia, and critical scholars today are in agreement. This is borrowed tradition, not original prophecy. The fingerprints are human all the way down. The Ashab al-Kahf isn't a miracle dropped from heaven. It's part of a long chain of myths retold, reframed, and rebranded across cultures. Many clues give us this answer as shown in this video. One more as a cherry on top. We are just told that the dog is lying at the entrance to the cave in the Quran, and yet this detail appears in no pre-Islamic record of the story that is known to us. In the version of the Sleepers legend by Jacob of Saru, written in 521 AD, the example of the tale most similar to the Quran's, there is a watcher whom God sets over the sleepers. They cry out, "We beseech you, good shepherd, who has chosen his servants, guard your flock from this wolf who thirsts for blood." And God left a watcher to be the guardian of their limbs. Although it would not be too hard to see how this watcher could be dog-like in some regard, like a guard dog outside an encampment or looking after sheep. This watcher appears more supernatural than canine. Only in the Quranic account is the companion of the sleepers an actual dog, as we've shown how this mythology of the dog appears in places around life and death as liminal creatures. This guardian in Christian lore easily was tweaked into a dog. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope this exploration of one story was exciting enough to want more, because much more is coming. I want to go through it all. I can already see it now. Muslim apologists hunting some ridiculous minor error or mistake made by me in this video, and discourage their fans to dismiss me with one word as a liar, a dishonest, or some other means of trying to distract them. But for those honest seekers who can see that much more can be unearthed just from this one example, they are my target audience. My goal is to show you that the Quran is a human product from start to finish. If you like mythology like me, then you can value this interesting storytelling and its symbolic value. Once you start to pretend this is history, that's where you lose the battle. So for all my Muslims out there who can see this for what it really is and decide somehow they're negotiating their culture, their tradition, their faith, whatever, and you're able to see a fact for what I'm saying, awesome, kudos to you. But for many of you, you might find, hey, this is a step too far for me to continue down this path in Islam. And for that, I understand as well. So be sure to subscribe to MythVision and hit the bell, because much more is coming on the Quran. In the next video, I hope to tackle Dhul Qarnayn, aka Alexander the Great, in the Quran. Comment what you liked most and join our Patreon to become part of the MythVision family to help us continue these projects. You gain early access to my videos and you can directly contact me there. Until next time, we are MythVision.